Inequality is a very controversial subject nowadays, and I assume this video is going to get me into some heat. But without risk, there is no reward. So let's get right into it. When we talk about economic inequality between different kinds of peoples or different countries, even in different historical periods, there's a common assumption that pretty much all of us make. And that is that inequality must be rooted in some kind of injustice or some kind of exploitation. If one group of people is doing well and another isn't, it must be that the better off group is somehow taking advantage of the group that isn't doing well, right? It is always assumed that the reason why some poor country is, well, poor, is that the wealthy country must have stolen their wealth somehow. But this way of thinking rests on a very flawed premise. It assumes that poverty is the exception to the rule. It assumes that for a country of people to be poor, something must have happened to make them poor. But here's the uncomfortable truth: poverty isn't the exception, it's the rule. Poverty isn't a result of some really bad or unfortunate circumstances. Poverty is the default. Wealth is what is rare and exceptional, and poverty is what's normal. Let's think about this. Ever since the beginning and throughout most of human history, life was a constant struggle for mere survival. Obviously, early humans spent their entire lives hunting, gathering, and scavenging in small communities with no guarantees of food, shelter, or safety. Starvation, disease, and predators were the norm, and most didn't even reach the age of 25, and this was the reality for everyone. Fast forward a few thousand years to when we figured out civilization, the situation wasn't all that much better, and most people lived in conditions that we today would consider to be unlivable. Even the most advanced civilizations of the classical period, like the Romans, still lived in conditions that we modern humans would consider to be poverty. But even Rome was the exception of the time period, with its bustling markets, aqueducts, public baths, and circuses compared to what the conditions of the rest of the world were like. If we contrast Rome with the Germanic tribes of the same period, they didn't live all that much better than the hunter-gatherers that preceded civilization. Rome was the most advanced civilization of the day, and yet when Rome was destroyed, poverty as the norm once again took over Europe. And it took centuries or even a millennia in some cases for the people of Europe to once again rise to the level of the Roman Empire in terms of some comforts that the Romans used to enjoy. For example, even in the 15th century, most European cities still did not have a reliable access to even a basic resource such as water that most Roman cities used to enjoy over 1,000 years earlier. For most of history, China was miles ahead of Europe. The Chinese had paper, gunpowder, movable type printing, and a highly organized bureaucracy, while much of Europe was fumbling through the Dark Ages. If you had a bet on which region would dominate the future, China would have been the obvious choice. Yet China was eclipsed by Europe in the 19th century and then went on to become one of the poorest regions. Japan used to be extremely poor for most of its history until it shot up to become one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. This reversal raises an interesting question. If Europe could overtake China after centuries of lagging behind, and Japan could then overtake Europe, why didn't every other part of the world catch up too? And today, the same pattern persists. The United States is the richest and most powerful country on Earth, with a standard of living unimaginable to most people throughout history. Western Europe isn't too far behind, and countries in East Asia like Japan, South Korea, and increasingly China have joined the ranks of the world's wealthy. Meanwhile, vast stretches of Africa, South Asia, and Latin America remain extremely poor. No matter where you are, for the vast majority of human history, life looked remarkably similar. You worked the land, hoped for a good harvest, and prayed you wouldn't get sick because there were no hospitals to save you, and you wouldn't even be able to comprehend what a warm shower is. Even today, in a world that feels so advanced and interconnected, poverty remains widespread. Entire nations face famines, lack of clean water, and limited education. And when we see this, our instinct is often to ask, what went wrong? But what if that's the wrong question? Here's a black pill. Nothing went wrong. Again, that is the norm. Instead of assuming that poverty is an anomaly, we should be asking, what went right in the places that aren't poor anymore. This shift in perspective is crucial because when we stop seeing poverty as the result of exploitation or some kind of global conspiracy, we can start to understand the deeper forces at play. What made the United States, for example, such an economic powerhouse while countries like Venezuela or Moldova struggle? Why did Europe pull ahead of the rest of the world during the 19th century? And why has East Asia, particularly Japan and South Korea, experienced rapid growth while others like North Korea or Afghanistan haven't? The answers to these questions aren't as simple as someone got exploited. The simplest answer is that building wealth, whether for individuals, nations, or entire civilizations, is incredibly hard. It takes the right combination of factors working together over long periods of time to create wealth. And if even one of those factors is missing, a society can fall behind. But before we get into what those factors are, let's clear up some common misconceptions. It's easy to blame wars, lack of natural resources, or even colonialism for why some places are rich and others are poor. But those explanations don't hold up under closer scrutiny. Let's start with war. War is an awful reality for too many people, even today. And it's easy to assume that war is one of the main reasons countries fall behind. After all, wars destroy cities, infrastructure, and entire economies. But here's the surprising part. War doesn't ruin a nation's ability to recover as much as you'd think. That's because war primarily destroys goods, not the human capital that built the wealth in the first place. Let's take World War II, one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. By the end of the war, basically all of Europe was in ruins. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and London were bombed to rubble. Industries were shattered, and millions of lives were lost. Yet, just a few decades later, Europe had bounced back. And not just to where it was before the war, but even further. Why? Because the people, the human capital remained. Europe still had its engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs. It still had the people that knew how to produce, run factories, develop machinery, and keep the economic machine running. It still had its cultural values, institutions, and knowledge base that took centuries to develop. The physical damage was immense, but the foundation of what created wealth was intact. That's why programs like the Marshall Plan, which provided relatively modest financial aid, worked so well in Europe. The money was like gasoline on a fire that was already smoldering. But in contrast, if we look at most modern examples of foreign aid, they don't seem to make a dent in helping poor nations develop. Over the decades, far more money has been sent to African nations in the form of aid than Europe ever received under the Marshall Plan. Yet, no African nation has seen the same kind of explosive growth. Why? Because aid can't replace what's missing there: the human capital necessary to turn that money into sustained development. By and large, Africa doesn't have people that have the knowledge required to create the same level of prosperity that is seen in the United States or in Europe, and no amount of capital aid can change that. That is something that takes many factors working together and a lot of time to be developed. Another example is the Balkans. During the 1990s, the wars in the former Yugoslavia were brutal, displacing millions and causing widespread destruction. But if you look at many of those countries today, like Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, you'll see that they've recovered. Why? Again, it's the human capital. Despite the destruction, the people still had the skills, knowledge, and drive to rebuild. Within about a decade of the conflict's ending, these nations were back on their feet. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they were back to how they were. So while war is devastating in the short term, it doesn't permanently cripple a nation's ability to create wealth, at least not if the human capital survives. That's why countries like Germany and Japan could emerge as economic powerhouses just a few decades after being reduced to rubble. Another common explanation for inequality between nations is natural resources. We often assume that having lots of natural resources like oil, gold, coal, or something else is the key to wealth. But in reality, that simply isn't the case. Dare I say, it doesn't even matter. If we look at nations worldwide, there are no patterns that can be drawn between abundant natural resources and wealth. Some resource-rich nations are poor, others are rich. Some resource-poor nations are rich, and yet others are poor. Let's start with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This country is one of the most resource rich places on Earth. It's loaded with diamonds, gold, cobalt, and vast mineral reserves that the global economy depends on. Most of the raw mineral deposits remain untapped and are worth an estimated $24 trillion. Yet, the DRC remains one of the poorest nations in the world. Now look at Venezuela. It has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet it's also extremely poor. Decades of mismanagement, over reliance on oil exports, and destructive government policies have turned what could have been a ticket to the first world into a complete disaster. Venezuela's case shows us something worrying, that resources can just as easily cause an economic collapse as they can growth. On the flip side, you've countries like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is also resource rich, but it's wealthy. Somehow, Saudi Arabia has managed to leverage its oil wealth to become one of the richest nations in the Middle East. Let's compare that to Norway, another oil rich country. Norway was already wealthy before oil was discovered in the North Sea. What oil did for Norway wasn't to make it rich, but to make it even richer than before. And then there's Switzerland. Switzerland has no oil, no diamonds, no sprawling fields of natural gas. In fact, it's a small, landlocked country with few obvious natural resources. Yet, it's one of the richest countries in the world. What these examples show is that natural resources are, at best, a bonus, not the foundation of wealth. So again, why are some nations rich while most remain poor? Another very common explanation is colonialism or conquest. The idea is that rich nations got rich by stealing from the poor ones through plunder, exploitation, and forced labor. And that's why the poor ones are poor today. While there's no doubt these practices were cruel and destructive, they aren't the reason some nations are wealthy today. Here's the first issue with the conquest argument. Disparities in wealth have to already exist for one group to conquer and occupy another as a colony. Empires don't just spring up out of nowhere. They're built by societies that are already organized, productive, and relatively advanced compared to their neighbors. Rome didn't rise to power by luck. It dominated because it was more developed than the tribes it conquered. The British didn't just wake up one day and decide they would conquer a quarter of the world. To achieve such a feat, they had to be far ahead of the nations they conquered. When nations did exploit others, it rarely gave them long-term prosperity. Take Spain, for example. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain became one of the most powerful empires in the world, thanks in large part to vast amounts of gold and silver it looted from the Americas. 200 tons of gold and 18,000 tons of silver were shipped from the New World to Spain. If exploiting wealth from other nations guaranteed lasting success, Spain would be one of the richest countries on Earth today, but instead, it is among the poorer nations of Europe. Contrast this with nations that were once colonies. The United States and Canada were British colonies, but they're now among the richest countries in the world. Hong Kong and Singapore, two other former colonies, are also global economic hubs that punch far above their weight. Clearly, being colonized doesn't automatically doom a nation to poverty. On the flip side, some nations that avoided colonization are still struggling. Thailand was never colonized, but it's not significantly wealthier than its neighbors that were, like Vietnam or Cambodia. Ethiopia also avoided colonization, yet it remains one of the poorest nations in the world. If colonialism were the defining factor, we'd expect these nations to be far better off than their colonized counterparts, but they aren't. Then there are nations that were never colonizers but are still incredibly wealthy. Norway, Switzerland, and Ireland didn't build empires or engage in widespread plunder, yet they rank among the richest countries in the world. Clearly, conquest isn't a requirement for prosperity. And what about nations built on conquest? Mongolia once ruled the largest continuous empire in history, stretching across much of Asia and Europe. By the logic of plunder equaling wealth, Mongolia should be the richest country today, but it's not. It's incredibly poor. The truth is, While conquest and colonialism certainly affected the course of history, they don't explain why some nations are rich and others are poor today. If anything, they're symptoms of inequality, not the cause. Richer, more advanced societies were more likely to conquer, and poorer, less developed ones were more likely to be conquered. So, just like war and natural resources, colonialism and conquest aren't the answer. In this example, it is helpful to think of nations like people. Are robbers likely to be successful in life? Not quite. Even though committing a robbery might give a robber a large injection of cash, robbers are still not very likely to become wealthy long term. So, what then is the answer? The answer to the question why some nations are poor and others are not is one that I gave you hints towards this entire video. And it's surprisingly simple: human capital. And no two nations have an equal amount of it. Nothing gets built, invented, or sustained without people who are sufficiently qualified to do so. Wealth doesn't magically spring from the ground, it's created by humans. It's the knowledge, skills, and habits of people that drive economies forward. And here's the thing: the development of human capital isn't equal, not even close. Different nations have had vastly different geographies, environments, and circumstances shaping their populations. These differences led to vastly different economic outcomes. Geographic factors are probably the most important when it comes to origins of civilization. It is silly to expect economic equality between ancient Mesoamericans and ancient Egyptians because of how different their circumstances were, and the same is true for today. Look at rivers, for example. Navigable rivers are like highways for economies, especially ancient ones before the Industrial Revolution and the advent of mass transportation over land. Rivers facilitate trade, encourage cities to form, and help civilizations grow. Compare the fertile Nile River Valley in Egypt to the arid deserts of its neighbors. The Nile gave Egypt a head start, enabling it to build one of the earliest great civilizations on the planet. And why didn't the ancient Arabs build a great civilization? Does it mean they were somehow exploited by the Egyptians? Of course not. Simply looking at different circumstances of the two peoples geographically gives us the answer. There are no permanent rivers in the deserts of Arabia, let alone ones that are navigable and would facilitate trade and civilization. Apart from trade, rivers also enable mass agriculture, allowing a civilization to support far more people than it otherwise would have been able to. And then those additional people can then move on to working other more advanced occupations that allow civilization to happen, such as smithing, masonry, craftsmanship, etc. When thinking about it this way, it is quite obvious why ancient Egypt might be far more likely to develop more human capital and develop it faster than the nomadic tribes of the Eurasian steppe. There is a reason that every ancient civilization sprung up along a river valley, but not all rivers are equal either. Not all rivers are equally large, equally navigable, or even equally consistent. Most African rivers alternate between gigantic moving lakes and tiny streams depending on whether or not it is a wet or dry season. And obviously, such alternating rivers aren't going to be as useful economically and lead to equal outcomes, as for example, the constant and tame Rhine of Germany or Seine of France. Another big factor at play is soil fertility and quality. It is ridiculous to imagine that people in the Yangtze River Valley and those in the deserts of Namibia would be able to produce an amount of food and, by extension, wealth that is even comparable in the ancient times. And so, why are we surprised when the outcomes of the two peoples are unequal? Was there any exploitation going on? Of course not. Apart from rivers and soil fertility, rainfall is also hugely important for agriculture, and reliable rainfall is a big advantage for cultivating crops. Wheat grown by the Irish or the English in the Middle Ages required no irrigation systems because of the near constant rain that is built into the climate in that part of the continent. Even moving a little south to the nations of the Mediterranean, where rain falls mostly in the winter, we get an entirely different agricultural environment. Many crops grown there require irrigation during the hot summer months and thus again require rivers to draw that water from. On the other hand, there are obvious deserts like the Sahara or the Arabian Desert, which basically negate any possibility of large scale agriculture. dooming the people living there to a nomadic herding lifestyle, which makes it almost impossible for them to develop the human capital required to generate great civilizations. Then there are mountains. While they're great for scenery, they're terrible for human capital. Mountainous regions isolate communities, making it harder for them to trade, share ideas, or form larger, more advanced societies. It's no coincidence that virtually all of the world's most advanced civilizations emerged in flatter, more open areas where people could interact and collaborate. This is not only because trade is easier, but also because people living in flatter areas, especially close to rivers, are much closer in terms of time taken to travel to each other's cultures and civilizations around them, and thus have access to a much larger cultural universe, allowing them to innovate and upgrade the innovations of other peoples. It is never the case that a people invented all of their technology by themselves, but it is always the case that their collective technological might is the result of the shared cultural universe around them. When Western Europeans clashed with the tribes of North America, the latter never stood a chance. The Europeans arrived in America on ships invented by the Portuguese, using muskets invented by the Spanish, gunpowder invented in China, herding animals domesticated in the Middle East and in the Eurasian steppes, using a number system invented in India and transmitted to them by Arabs, and on the back of knowledge and many more innovations from ancient Greece and the Islamic civilization. The North American natives, by comparison, did not stand a chance to invent all of those things by themselves, nor could they have been inspired by other civilizations around them simply because their cultural universe was so much smaller. The Iroquois, for example, had no knowledge of the Aztecs or the Mayans or the Incas, let alone that of the Old World civilizations. And so, is it a surprise that they were so far behind the Old World who relied on the much larger cultural universe present there? Then there are animals that also play a gigantic role. The domestication of cows, sheep, horses, or oxen was a massive advancement for civilizations that had access to them. Good luck building large buildings or massive structures without heavy duty beasts of burden, or sustaining populations in agriculturally poor regions without cattle like goats or sheep. No matter how intelligent or adaptable people may be, it is an almost impossible task. All of these animals made virtually everything more productive, and they enabled transportation over long distances, even though it was far less efficient than over water. If we compare the animals available in Eurasia to those in North America or Australia, are we again surprised that such a large disparity between the old and new world civilizations existed before they even met? And finally, we come to culture, possibly the biggest factor influencing the development of human capital. Cultural values shape how people approach work, education, and innovation. Societies that prioritize long term thinking, cooperation, and learning tend to develop more advanced institutions and civilizations, which in turn support economic growth. For example, take Japan, the subject of my latest video. Japan has very few natural resources, yet is one of the richest nations on earth. Its success lies in its culture, values like discipline, hard work, and a strong sense of community. These traits have driven Japan to excel in fields like manufacturing, technology, and design. On the other hand, a society with cultural norms that discourage innovation or undermine trust is at a disadvantage, no matter how resource rich it might be. Culture is in many ways connected to the environment and is shaped by it, sometimes in ways we wouldn't really expect. Let's take broadly the cultures of the tropical versus the temperate regions as an example. Living in the temperate regions that have winters might seem as a disadvantage initially because it makes it significantly harder to grow food when the land has to be plowed early in the spring, seeds sown just in time to be harvested in autumn, and then stored for the upcoming winter. Whereas in the tropical regions, food is available and pretty much plentiful all year round. However, when we compare the civilizations of the temperate regions versus those in the tropical regions, we find a striking difference. In almost all cases, the people of the temperate regions seems to have done immeasurably better than those living in the tropics. What could influence that? It is an interesting observation to discover that many cultures coming from tropical regions didn't quite develop a strict sense of time or urgency, unlike those from the temperate regions who had to master timing and urgency as well as a habit of saving in order to survive harsh winters. Natural abundance seems to be a double edged sword because scarcity forces people to become hardworking, frugal, and resourceful, which means they develop skills, or human capital, faster than people who aren't forced to by scarcity. This is kind of like how kids of millionaires who are never forced to do any kind of work turn into incompetent imbeciles when they grow up. This phenomenon is especially visible when people coming from cultures from these harsh environments migrate to other regions where resources are far more abundant. And there, they very quickly rise above the native population because of the positive habits their culture developed due to harsh circumstances. For example, when the southern Chinese migrated to more promising lands like the United States, Thailand, or Malaysia, even though they seldom brought any money with them, they very quickly rose above the native inhabitants of those regions due to the human capital that they brought along with them. Yet, many in these aforementioned regions cried oppression throughout history because they assumed the Chinese were oppressing them simply because they were wealthier. Sometimes progress depends on whether people even seek it. Among different societies, the number of people who seek progress and to, quote, make something of themselves, and the number of people who are content with the status quo are very different. And so, are we again surprised that that leads to different economic outcomes? Some cultures are simply more accepting towards others' cultures and willing to learn from them, while others are non adaptive and refuse to learn from others. China and Japan both shut themselves off from the rest of the world for centuries. And are we then surprised that the rest of the world overtook them economically during that time? Cultural attitudes to knowledge also matter a lot, and these can change over time as well. During the Islamic Golden Age, the Arab world was the center of knowledge seeking and learning. The Arab universities were the most prestigious in the entire world, and the Arabs even reintroduced Aristotle and other Greek philosophers to Europe by rediscovering and translating their books, which then made their way to Europe, kickstarting the Renaissance. Nowadays, the story is completely different. A UN study reveals that today there is one book each year being translated in the Arab world for every 1 million Arabs. To put that into perspective, the Spanish translate 920 books into Spanish for every 1 million Spaniards. If we extrapolate that trend into the future, it means that at today's rate, Spain translates in 1 year what the Arab world translates in 1,000 years. Are we then surprised that the Arab world has fallen behind Europe as they have lost their thirst for knowledge and learning? Then there is another fact which dictates prosperity in the modern world, which is economic policy. There is hardly a point in having immense human capital when that human capital isn't allowed to enrich the nation. A paradox of sorts is how the Chinese and Indians seem to prosper anywhere they go, apart from China and India itself. In 1994, the 57 million Chinese living outside of China produced as much wealth as the 1 billion Chinese living in China. As China's economy started opening up and liberalizing, the Chinese started becoming richer. And same is true for India a few decades later, which shows us that it was the economic policy, not the people themselves, keeping both nations poor. Inequality is the norm, and poverty is the norm. So instead of asking ourselves what went wrong with nations that became poor, we should ask what went right for those that became rich. If we want to explain inequality, we only need to look at various factors that influence the development of human capital. And if we want to prop up poor nations and increase their wealth, then we should look at those already wealthy and learn from them, from their laws, economic policies, and their cultures. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, as more than 99% of you watching this are not subscribed, and would help me immensely in continuing to make these videos for you all for free. Also be sure to share your thoughts with me in the comments. Do you agree with me, or do you think I'm completely in the wrong here? Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.